He was a warrior hardened by vengeance, who lived to destroy his greatest enemy. But in the final act of his personal war, he found the one thing that would force him to become a father, the daughter of the man he hated most. If stories about the power of redemption resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. The dust of the Sierra Madre mixed with the acrid smoke of the burning wagons, a scene of destruction that was Gojit's signature. His feet, clad in worn moccasins, moved with a ghostly familiarity among the bodies of the Mexican soldiers. The silence that followed the battle was filled only by the crackling of fire and the wind whistling through the cacti. He was a long shadow under the relentless Chihuahua sun, his face a mask of soot and contained fury, the muscles of his arms tense as his spear hovered over the last surviving soldier. This was not just an enemy. It was a symbol, one less step on the ladder that would lead him to Captain Vargas, the architect of his pain. The soldier's eyes begged for a mercy that Gojit had long forgotten how to grant. His world was simple, reduced to a single purpose, revenge. And he was about to perform another bloody ritual on this altar of hatred. At the very instant the final blow was to be struck, a sharp, fragile sound cut through the heavy air of carnage. It was not the cry of a wounded man, but the desperate wail of a child. The sound seemed out of place, an impossible note in that symphony of death. The tip of Gojit's spear froze inches from the soldier's neck, his attention diverted to a torn piece of canvas trembling near a broken wheel. The warrior, whose name meant "he who walks alone," moved with the caution of a predator, pulling back the burnt fabric to reveal the source of the sound. There, huddled and covered in dust, was a girl no more than 5 years old, her large brown eyes fixed on him, paralyzed by terror. On her small dress, a silver brooch gleamed, a familiar crest that made Gojit's heart stop. It was the emblem of Captain Vargas. The spear in his hand suddenly felt heavy, no longer a tool of vengeance, but a burden. But to understand how we reached this point, we need to go back in time. Years before the smoke and crying in that caravan, Gojit was more than a specter of vengeance. He had a family, a place by the fire of his people, the Chiricahua. His life unfolded to the rhythm of the seasons in the vastness of the Sierra Madre Occidental, an existence of hunting, ceremonies, and teachings passed down from generation to generation. But that life was stolen in a bloody dawn. Mexican troops, led by a young and ambitious Captain Vargas, descended upon his camp with merciless brutality, seeking to eradicate what they called the savage threat. Gojit, returning from a hunt, found only silence and death. His wife, his young son, his parents, all were slaughtered. That day, something inside him broke and solidified into an icy purpose. He became the sole survivor, a man whose body was a map of scars and whose soul carried only one, the image of the massacre. From that moment on, Gojit began to walk alone, even when surrounded by his own people. He became a legend, whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence, the most lethal of the Apache warriors, a ghost who haunted the Mexican patrols. While the other Chiricahuas fought to survive, to keep their traditions alive, Gojit fought to die, but not before taking Vargas's entire world with him. He trained with a ferocity that bordered on self-destruction, his hands turning every branch and every stone into a potential weapon. His heart, which had once known the warmth of his family's love, was now a furnace that burned only with hatred. He believed that tenderness and compassion had been buried along with his loved ones, leaving only a void that only revenge could fill, if only for a brief and glorious final moment. The world around Gojit was as unforgiving as his heart. The late 1870s marked a period of increasing violence on the border between Mexico and the United States, a no-man's land where laws were dictated by force. To the Apaches, the Sierra Madre was more than a refuge of mountains and canyons. It was the last bastion of their freedom, a sacred sanctuary. Every rocky peak, every hidden stream was an ally in their war of resistance. But the pressure mounted daily. Mexican military forts appeared like scars on the landscape, and the advance of settler settlements pushed his people into increasingly arid and inhospitable territories. The wild beauty of that land, with its sunsets that painted the sky in orange and purple, contrasted brutally with the oppression and the constant threat of annihilation that hung over the tribes. It was a world at war, and Gojit was its most devoted son. It was amidst this tense scenario that the news arrived, brought by an exhausted scout. Captain Vargas, now a high-ranking officer, would be personally supervising the transport of a supply convoy through a known canyon. For the first time in years, a trace of something other than pure hatred flickered in Gojit's eyes. It was the anticipation of the end. He saw the finger of fate pointing to that moment, the opportunity for which he had bled, trained, and isolated himself. The preparation for the attack was a methodical and silent ritual. He did not seek the help of other warriors. This was a personal journey, a sacred settling of accounts. He prepared his arrows, sharpened his knife, and painted his face not with the war colors of his people, but with the ashes of an extinguished fire, symbolizing the fire that had consumed his former life. He was not preparing for a battle, but for his final act. The ambush was executed with the lethal precision of a hawk diving for its prey. Gojit used the terrain to his advantage, turning the canyon into a deadly trap. He emerged from the shadows of the rocks, a silent apparition that brought with it a storm of arrows. Chaos erupted among the soldiers, their military tactics useless against an enemy that seemed to be part of the mountain itself. For Gojit, combat was a macabre dance he knew intimately. Every move was instinctive, every blow calculated for maximum efficiency. He felt no fear, not even the adrenaline of battle, only the cold pulse of his objective. He scanned the face of each soldier who fell, searching for a pair of eyes, a scar, a uniform that would identify him as Vargas. The caravan was just the cocoon, and he was determined to tear it open to find the creature he hated inside. When the last shot echoed and silence returned to the canyon, stained only by the moans of the wounded, Gojit realized the bitter truth. Captain Vargas was not there. The intelligence was wrong, or perhaps fate had mocked him once more. The fury that had driven him during the fight dissipated, leaving behind a vast and desolate emptiness. He stood, the victor on a battlefield with no prize, the climax of his life revealing itself to be an empty scene. His vengeance, the pillar that had sustained his existence, crumbled to dust. And it was in this very moment of deep desolation, as his life's purpose vanished like smoke, that he heard it, a fragile cry coming from within the rubble of his hollow victory. The sound hit him harder than any bullet, guiding him to the girl with terror-filled eyes and the silver crest that would change everything. Gojit's courage at this moment is what inspires us. If you also feel this strength, show your support by leaving a comment, and so you don't miss a single step of this and other incredible journeys of overcoming, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. With the girl before him, Gojit found himself on a battlefield for which he had no training. His warrior instincts screamed contradictory orders. She was the seed of his enemy, a dangerous burden that should be left behind. The cold logic of survival dictated that her presence was a threat, a direct link to Vargas that would put him at risk. However, his eyes, which had witnessed the massacre of his own family, could not bear the image of another innocent child abandoned to her fate. For a long moment, he stood paralyzed, the embodiment of a paradox. The hatred for her father fought against the image of his own son. With a stiff, almost painful gesture, he held out his hand, not with a weapon, but with a canteen of water. The girl recoiled at first, but thirst overcame fear. That simple act of giving her a drink was the first crack in the armor of vengeance he had built around himself. The journey back to the Chiricahua camp, deep in the Sierra, was an ordeal. Gojit, accustomed to moving like the wind, swift and silent, was now chained to the slow, hesitant pace of small feet. He had to abandon the dangerous, steep trails he preferred, opting for safer routes that left him exposed for longer. The silence that was once his ally was now constantly broken by the girl's occasional crying or her murmured questions in a language he barely understood. He watched her stumble on stones but get up without complaining, continuing to walk with a silent stubbornness. It was this tenacity that led him to give her a name, Anawa, meaning turtle in his language. It was not a name given with affection, but with a nod of recognition to her surprising and resilient ability to keep going, to carry her small world on her back, just as he carried the weight of his past. Gojit's arrival at the hidden camp was not the return of a hero. As he emerged from the pine trail with the small Mexican girl in tow, a tense, heavy silence fell over the community. The women preparing food stopped, the men sharpening their knives looked up, and the children who were playing hid behind their mothers. On the faces of his people, Gojit saw not relief or curiosity, but a mixture of shock and deep mistrust. That child was not a prisoner. She wore the enemy's clothes and looked at everyone with the same fear they felt for the soldiers. For a tribe living under the constant threat of extermination, bringing the daughter of a Mexican captain into their sanctuary was more than reckless. It was sacrilege. Murmurs spread like wildfire, and the once feared warrior now found himself isolated by a wall of hostility. The mistrust soon found a voice, and that voice belonged to Taza. Young, strong, and impetuous, Taza saw Gojit not just as a warrior, but as the embodiment of the Apache spirit of resistance. He had grown up hearing the stories of his ferocity and modeled his own warrior identity in Gojit's image. To see his idol returning not with the head of an enemy, but hand in hand with the daughter of one, was an unbearable betrayal. "What is this, Gojit?" he questioned, his voice loud enough for all to hear, the respect in his tone replaced by a burning accusation. "Did you go to hunt the wolf and come back caring for its cub? Where is the warrior? Who inspired us? Where is the vengeance for your family? You dishonor them with this weakness." Taza's words echoed the sentiment of many, solidifying the division within the band and positioning him as the voice of lost tradition and honor. Amidst the growing wall of hostility, one figure moved against the tide. Nalin, an elder whose eyes held the wisdom of many seasons and the pain of many losses, approached slowly. Her face, a map of wrinkles that told the story of her people, showed no fear or anger, but a deep and serene compassion. She, who had buried her own children, victims of the same war that consumed Gojit, did not see the daughter of an enemy, but only the familiar pain of lost innocence. Ignoring the disapproving glares, she knelt before Anawa and offered her a small piece of mesquite bread, a simple gesture of welcome. "A child does not choose the tent in which she is born," she said, her words directed at Gojit, but with the force of a decree for the entire tribe. "Her spirit is pure. It is up to us to keep it that way." Nalin's act did not silence the critics, but it gave Gojit an island of sanity in an ocean of condemnation. Realizing that Anawa's presence in the main camp was like a spark near a powder keg, Gojit made a decision. He took her to an old hunting shelter higher in the mountains, a shallow cave hidden by a curtain of willows. Far from accusing eyes, a fragile routine began to form. The warrior, whose skills were forged for destruction, had to relearn the world in order to teach it. He showed Anawa how to follow the tracks of a rabbit, not to kill it, but to understand its path. He taught her to distinguish blackberry leaves from poison ivy, and how to find water filtered through the sand of a dry riverbed. Every lesson was an exercise in patience he did not know he possessed. In teaching the child to survive in the wild, Gojit began, without realizing it, to rediscover his own place in it, a place not defined by war, but by subsistence and respect. The survival lessons slowly gave way to something deeper. On cold mountain nights, sitting by a small fire, the silence between them began to be filled with words. Gojit, who had not told stories since his own son was small, found himself sharing the legends of his people. He spoke of Usen, the creator, who gave the land to the Apaches as a gift to be cared for. He explained how every plant and every animal possessed a spirit, and that life was a circle of mutual respect, not domination. For Anawa, who grew up in a world of walls and rigid rules, those stories were portals to a magical universe. For Gojit, each word was like unearthing a part of his soul. In passing on the culture of his people to the daughter of his enemy, he was, in fact, rescuing himself from the spiritual exile in which he lived. Meanwhile, far away, in the confines of a Mexican fort, Captain Vargas was living his own hell. The news of the attack on the caravan arrived along with the devastating confirmation that his daughter was missing. The man Gojit saw as a relentless monster was, at that moment, just a father broken by despair. Vargas's pain turned into a blind rage. He refused to believe his daughter could be dead. In his mind, she had been taken, kidnapped by a savage, a soulless beast. Fueled by this terrifying image and a lifetime of prejudice, he organized the largest patrol the region had ever seen. He offered rewards, recruited scouts, and set off for the Sierra Madre with a single obsessive purpose: to hunt the monster who took his daughter and rescue her at any cost, leaving a trail of fear and violence in his wake. The change in Gojit did not happen in a single moment of epiphany, but in a series of small gestures that eroded the wall of his hatred. One afternoon, while exploring near the shelter, Anawa slipped on a loose stone, falling and getting a nasty cut on her knee. Her cry was one of fright and pain, a sound that would have previously irritated Gojit, but now struck him with a protective urgency. Without hesitation, he picked her up, an act that felt both strange and painfully familiar. He carried her to the edge of a stream, cleaned the wound with the gentleness of a healer, and applied a paste of wild sage leaves, a piece of wisdom his mother had taught him and that he thought he had forgotten. As he tied a piece of cloth around her knee, his calloused, war-torn fingers trembled slightly. He wasn't just treating a wound. He was caring for a life, and in that act, he felt the ghost of his own heart begin to beat again. As the connection between Gojit and Anawa deepened in the solitude of the mountains, the descent in the Apache camp solidified. Taza, blinded by his idealized vision of the warrior Gojit should be, saw each day the girl remained with them as a new stain on his people's honor. He began to gather the younger, more restless warriors, those who, like him, felt that compassion was a luxury they could no longer afford. He spoke of Gojit no longer with reverence, but with a mixture of pity and contempt. "He is bewitched," Taza would say in a low voice around the fire. "That child is bait, and Vargas's army is the bear that will follow her. If Gojit will not cut the line, we will have to do it for him, for the survival of us all." His admiration had turned into a dangerous determination, and he began to watch Gojit's movements, convinced he was protecting his mentor from his own madness. The moons came and went, and the seasons began to change in the Sierra. Anawa was no longer the fragile, terrified girl from the caravan. Her body was stronger, her skin tanned by the sun, and her feet moved with growing confidence on the rocky trails. She learned the silent language of the forest, to recognize the call of a hawk and the smell of approaching rain. One afternoon, Gojit watched her from a distance as she tried, with childlike concentration, to weave a small basket from yucca leaves. Imitating the movements he had shown her, an almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. In that moment, the truth hit him with the force of a lightning bolt. The desire to see that girl grow, to keep her safe, had become the new driving force of his life. The image of Vargas's face, which for years had haunted his every waking moment, was becoming a faded ghost, replaced by the vibrant reality of the child before him. The precarious peace of their mountain refuge was brutally shattered by the arrival of a scout, a young man loyal to Nalin, who came up the trail panting and with eyes wide with alarm. The news he brought was the materialization of all of Gojit's fears. "They are close," the scout whispered, catching his breath. "Vargas's soldiers. They found the ambush site and followed your tracks. They are less than 2 days' walk from here, and they are not hunting blind. They are moving with the certainty of someone who knows what they are looking for." The reality of the situation fell on Gojit like an avalanche. The outside world, which he had managed to keep at a distance, was about to violently collide with the new life he had reluctantly built. Vargas's hunt was no longer a distant threat. It was a real and imminent presence, and he and Anawa were directly in its path. The news acted like a whip, awakening the dormant warrior within Gojit. Years of survival instincts, honed in countless battles and escapes, came to the forefront. But for the first time, these instincts were not fueled by hatred, but by an overwhelming protective terror. His mind, once focused on how to kill Vargas, now calculated escape routes, wind speed, the probability of rain to hide their tracks. In minutes, he transformed their shelter into nothing more than a shadow on the landscape. He put out the fire, spread dirt over the ashes, and erased any sign of their presence with a pine branch. Anawa, sensing the urgency in his silence, acted with remarkable discipline for her age. She collected her small bag of belongings and stood beside him, ready, her eyes fixed on his face, waiting for his guidance. She was no longer a burden. She was his silent partner in this dangerous dance of survival. Before they could disappear into the higher trails, the scout delivered the second part of his grim message, his words falling like stones. "It's not just the soldiers, Gojit. It's Taza." He explained that the news of Vargas's patrol had spread through the camp like wildfire, and Taza had used the people's fear as a weapon. He had convinced a group of warriors that Anawa was the cause of their impending doom, an unwitting traitor who would lead them to destruction. They argued that handing her over to Vargas was the only way to appease the captain and save the tribe. Now Taza and his followers were coming up the mountain, not to warn him, but to take the girl by force. The revelation was devastating. Gojit was no longer simply fleeing from an enemy. He was caught in a deadly trap, with Vargas's vengeance approaching from one side and the betrayal of his own people coming from the other. For a moment, the weight of the situation threatened to crush Gojit. Trapped between the hammer of Vargas's hatred and the anvil of Taza's betrayal, there was nowhere to run. The warrior tasted the bitter irony. To protect his enemy's daughter, he was now being hunted by his own brothers. The path of revenge had led him to a dead end, and the path of love had put him in the same place. The old Gojit, the shadow driven by hate, would have turned to face Taza, would have plunged the tribe into a bloody conflict to protect what was his. But he looked at Anawa, who watched him with unwavering confidence, and knew that this path was forever closed to him. He could not stain her innocence with the blood of his people. Violence had been his only language for too long, but now he needed to find new words, new strategies, forged not in the fire of hate, but in the desperate clarity of protective love. As he hid behind a rock formation, listening to the distant sound of soldiers on one side and imagining Taza's approach on the other, a new and terrible idea began to form in his mind. It was a plan that went against all his warrior instincts, a gamble that defied the logic of survival. If he could no longer flee from his enemies, perhaps he should orchestrate the encounter. He would no longer run from Vargas. He would go towards him, not to fight, not to surrender, but to create a stage a place where he could force the captain to see the truth, not through a rifle sight, but through the eyes of his own daughter. He would use all his skill not to kill, but to control the narrative. He would return Anawa, but he would do it on his own terms, in a final act that would forever redefine the meaning of his personal war. The decision was made. The hunt was over. The performance was about to begin. With the new strategy drawn up, Gojit reversed the roles. From the hunted, he became the hunter. But his prey was not a man, but the perfect opportunity. He and Anawa began to move in a dangerous game of shadows, mirroring the route of Vargas's patrol from the ridges and canyons that offered cover. Gojit used every bit of his ancestral knowledge of the land, reading the terrain as if it were a living map. He taught Anawa to distinguish the sound of military boots on gravel from the sound of a wild animal, to recognize the glint of binoculars in the distance. He needed to know everything: the size of Vargas's force, their sentry patterns, the camp routine. Every detail was a piece in the deadly puzzle he was assembling, a puzzle where a single mistake would mean death for them both. They were two ghosts haunting the army that hunted them. On a cold night, hidden behind a granite outcrop 100 meters from the Mexican camp, Gojit finally saw his enemy's face clearly. Through a clearing, in the flickering light of a solitary campfire, he watched Captain Vargas. He did not see the arrogant and cruel commander who lived in his memories, the architect of his pain. Instead, he saw a man bent by the weight of the world, his face marked by exhaustion and despair. He saw Vargas take a small ribbon from his coat pocket, a child's ribbon, faded pink, and stare at it, his jaw tight to contain an emotion that threatened to overflow. In that instant, the pure hatred that had fueled Gojit for years was contaminated by something new and disturbing: recognition. He was looking at a reflection of his own suffering, the pain of a father who had lost a child. And he understood that the success of his plan depended not on his strength as a warrior, but on his ability to reach that father. Raising the stakes in his desperate game, Gojit chose the stage for the final confrontation. It was a narrow canyon, a labyrinth of rock walls known to the Apaches as the Thunder's Throat, famous for its sudden storms and violent flash floods. The signs were all there. The air was heavy and electric. The birds were flying low, and the clouds on the horizon were gathering with a dark and threatening hue. Nature was about to unleash its fury, and Gojit planned to use it as his main ally. He led Anawa to a high and safe ledge, almost a small cave in the canyon wall, hidden from view below, but with a clear view of the entire passage. "When the water comes, you will stay here," he said in a low voice, his calmness designed to reassure her. "No matter what you hear or see, do not move until I call. Do you trust me?" The girl just nodded, her large eyes reflecting a faith that was Gojit's new source of strength. With Anawa safe, Gojit descended to the canyon entrance to prepare his trap. He needed both groups to follow him there, and timing was essential. He couldn't leave a trail that seemed deliberate. It had to be the trail of a man on the run, exhausted and making mistakes. He left a clear footprint in a patch of mud where he normally would have stepped on rocks. Further on, he accidentally dropped a small corn husk doll that Anawa had made, an object that Taza would surely mock as a sign of weakness, but that Vargas's scouts might interpret as proof that his daughter was alive and nearby. Each clue was a carefully calibrated invitation, a bait cast in two different directions. He was calling his hunters to the center of his web, knowing that once they entered the canyon's throat, there would be no turning back. The storm was coming, both in the sky and on the earth. As Gojit had predicted, Taza was the first to arrive. He and his group of warriors moved quickly through the canyon, the arrogance in their steps fueled by the seemingly careless trail they had followed. To Taza, every poorly hidden footprint was a confirmation of his former mentor's weakness. He saw the canyon not as a trap, but as the end of the line for Gojit's madness. "He is cornered," Taza told his men, his voice echoing off the stone. Walls. Spread out. He cannot escape from here. As they positioned themselves, blocking the only exit, the first drops of rain, thick and cold, began to fall, staining the dust on their cheeks. The sky darkened quickly, mirroring the grim determination in the young warrior's heart. He was convinced that he was moments away from restoring his tribe's honor, with no idea that he was merely playing his part in a script that was not his own. Moments later, the imposing figure of Captain Vargas appeared at the canyon entrance, closely followed by his soldiers. The sight of the group of Apache warriors, bows drawn and faces painted, caused the soldiers to raise their rifles instantly. The metallic sound of weapons being cocked echoed through the canyon, creating an almost unbearable tension. The two enemy groups, both hunting the same man for opposite reasons, found themselves face to face, a step away from a bloodbath. But it was Vargas who broke the stalemate. "Hold your fire," he ordered loudly, his command echoing with the desperate authority of a father. His eyes did not fix on the warriors as targets, but swept frantically over the rocks and shadows ahead, searching for a glimpse of a small dress, a sign of his daughter. At that moment, he was not a soldier. He was a man willing to face any threat, but not before exhausting the last hope of finding his daughter alive. At the moment of maximum tension, as the first thunder rumbled in the sky, a lone figure appeared on a high rocky ledge, silhouetted against the dark clouds. It was Gojit. He did not shout a war cry or shoot an arrow. He simply revealed himself, a calm and imposing presence in the heart of the impending chaos. Immediately, he became the lightning rod for all the pent-up fury in the canyon. The soldiers' rifles turned towards him. The bowstrings of Taza's warriors drew taut. He was the target, the center towards which all violence converged. The rain, which had been falling in drops, turned into a downpour, soaking the canyon walls and beginning to form a stream where there had only been dust. Gojit remained motionless for an instant, drawing every pair of eyes, making sure that no one, neither Mexican nor Apache, was looking at the small crevice in the rock where Anawa was hiding. The first shot broke the spell, the bullet ricocheting off the rocks near Gojit. And then he moved. With an agility that defied logic, he began a calculated retreat, not away, but deeper into the canyon. He was a ghost, using every shadow, every rock as cover, eluding both the soldiers' bullets and the arrows of his own people. He did not fight back, did not try to hurt anyone. His only goal was to lure them in, to pull the two hostile forces into the bowels of nature's trap. As he ran, his powerful voice cut through the sound of the growing storm. "The mountain protects the innocent," he shouted, the words not directed at Taza, but thrown in Vargas's direction. "A father knows what must be done." He wasn't fighting, he was communicating in the only language his enemies would understand at that moment, that of combat, but with a message hidden in his actions. Exactly as Gojit had planned, the fury of the mountain joined his own. A low roar, deeper than thunder, began to vibrate through the stones. Coming from the head of the canyon, a wall of muddy water and debris descended with terrifying speed. The flash flood, Gojit's secret weapon, turned the canyon floor into a deadly whirlpool. Panic erupted instantly between the two groups of pursuers. The enmity between Apaches and Mexicans dissolved before a common and implacable enemy, nature. Men who moments before were trying to kill each other now clung to the same rocks to avoid being swept away by the current. Weapons were lost, orders became useless shouts against the power of the water. The hunt was over, replaced by a desperate and primitive struggle for survival, just as Gojit had anticipated. While chaos reigned below, Gojit, who had already climbed to a safe place, executed the final act of his plan. He located Vargas, who was clinging to a rock, his face pale with terror as the water rose dangerously. "Captain!" Gojit shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. When Vargas's eyes found him, Gojit did not point a weapon, but extended his arm, pointing firmly to the high, dry ledge where Anawa was. Vargas followed his finger, and through the curtain of rain, he saw her, his daughter, not crying, not hurt, but safe, watching the fury of the water from an untouched sanctuary. In that instant, the captain's perception shattered. That Apache warrior had not led his daughter into the trap. He had led everyone else into it. He was not the monster of his nightmares. He was his daughter's guardian, the only one who had kept her safe not only from him, but from the mountain itself. When the storm finally passed and the water level began to drop, the canyon fell into an exhausted silence. Mexicans and Apaches, soaked and muddy, looked at each other no longer with hatred, but with the silent respect of those who had survived a shared ordeal. Taza, leaning against a rock, watched Gojit from a distance. The arrogance in his eyes had been washed away by the flood, replaced by a humbling admiration. He finally understood. This was not weakness. It was a kind of strength he had never imagined, a strategy that used wisdom instead of fury. Gojit had not only saved the girl, he had prevented a massacre, using the mountain itself to disarm everyone without spilling a drop of his people's blood. The honor that Taza believed was lost had, in fact, been redefined before his eyes in a much deeper and more powerful way. Gojit descended from his high position and went to the ledge to get Anawa. He took her by the hand and guided her over the now safe rocks. At the bottom of the canyon, Captain Vargas stepped forward, his heart beating uncontrollably, his arms open to receive the daughter he thought he had lost forever. But Anawa, upon seeing her father, did something no one expected. She ran, yes, but her first impulse took her directly to Gojit. She hugged him tightly, clinging to his leg in a gesture of pure trust and affection, a final, silent farewell to her protector. Only then did she turn and run into Vargas's arms. The captain embraced her, relief flooding over him, but his eyes remained fixed on Gojit, witnessing that small act that said more than any words. He had not rescued his daughter from a monster. He was receiving her back from a father. On the canyon floor, among the debris of the storm, the two men faced each other. Vargas, with Anawa safe in his arms, looked at the Apache warrior, and for the first time saw him without the filter of hatred or fear. He saw the man who had been more of a father to his daughter in recent months than he ever could have been in his blind and violent search. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between their worlds, and none were needed. Captain Vargas simply gave a slight nod, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one laden with the weight of an unpayable debt, the end of a hunt, and the acknowledgement of one man by another. It wasn't forgiveness, nor friendship. It was something rarer, a silent understanding forged in fire and water that ended the war between them forever. Gojit received the gesture, his expression impassive, and knew his work was done. Without a word of goodbye, Gojit turned and began to walk, away from the world of men and back into the heart of the mountains. His figure, wounded but whole, retreated into the shadows, his steps no longer those of a ghost haunted by vengeance, but those of a guardian returning to his post. Taza, Vargas, and all the others just watched in silence as he was swallowed by the landscape, becoming once again part of the land he knew so well. He was not returning to the loneliness of a man who had lost everything, but to the solitude of one who had found a purpose greater than himself. He walked away, not as the most feared warrior, the specter of death, but as something new, a legend born of compassion, destined to be whispered around the campfires of both peoples for generations. Gojit was never again seen in the war councils or on the hunting trails with other warriors. He lived the rest of his days in the peaceful solitude of the Sierra Madre. But his loneliness was no longer a void. It was a space filled with the silent memory of a girl and the peace of a fulfilled purpose. He became a guardian of the land, a silent observer of the seasons. his heart no longer a stone of hatred, but fertile ground where compassion had taken root. To the Chiricahuas, especially to a now wiser Taza, Gojit's story became a new kind of saga, one that taught that a warrior's greatest bravery lies not in his ability to destroy, but in his courage to protect, even if the protected was the seed of his greatest enemy. He was no longer a man who walked alone because of pain, but a spirit who walked in peace with the world. The story of Gojit and Anawa crossed borders, becoming a legend whispered in Spanish and Apache, the unlikely chronicle of a man whose hatred was as vast as the desert, but whose heart proved to be even larger. It teaches us that resilience is not about not falling, but about the strength we find to get up, transformed by our trials. It demonstrates that even in the heart, most hardened by vengeance, the seed of humanity can flourish, nourished by the simplest act of caring for another. Gojit's path reminds us that our true purpose is often not found in the destination we plan, but in the detours we are forced to take. If this message has touched your heart, subscribe and share this story so that more people can discover the power of redemption. Thank you for watching.